In Alfred Hitchcock's 1954 Rear Window, the first and third person perspectives of the camera are masterfully altered, manipulated, and played off of one another. The audience gets the view of Jeffries through his telephoto lens and a view of Jeffries through reaction shots. Now imagine the same film with only the first person shots, or an entire film composed of the first person, or its use in a meaningful light. Oftentimes, this gives the spectator far more questions than direct answers in a typical film experience, and little in the way of interpretation. The first person in film tends to complicate ideas of character identification, including ideas of the male gaze and the ideal spectator. Ever yet, it incorporates new, ever-evolving technology in order to make the camera, and in turn the viewer, an active participant. Also diving into further ideas of phenomenology, or the study of structures of consciousness and its inherent characteristics. Through Lady in the Lake, one of the first instances of the first-person perspective, Hardcore Henry, a recent take on the first person, and Being John Malkovich, an ultimate complication of spectatorship and its understanding, the first-person perspective and its relation to the audience are understood and explored in their own ways. In 1943, author Raymond Chandler released Lady in the Lake, one of the many Philip Marlowe novels starring a daring detective in a long-standing mystery series. 4 years later, Robert Montgomery intended to recapture the same literary experience of the first-person perspective. The film is entirely from Marlowe's perspective, played by Robert Montgomery himself. First person in almost all instances. The audience sees what he sees, as Montgomery, or Marlowe rather, speaks with other characters and sometimes addresses the audience, while investigating crime scenes and other detective circumstances. In an article for Brooklyn College on Lady in the Lake, Professor John Beatty examines and analyzes the film and its concepts. He notes that, quote, in linguistics, the first person refers to the speaker. The second person is the person to whom the speaker speaks. The third person is the person about whom the speaker speaks. And in the standard whodunit, it is the task of the audience to try to compete with the film's detective to see who can solve the mystery first. In this case, by linking the audience to the detective, a certain complexity arises in the film. Can you compete with yourself? Is it a gimmick, as in something put into the film to be different, or does it have a function? As mentioned, certain complexities develop as the viewer is directly tied to the detective in every sense, of course with no control on their own part. It is as if the viewer is on rails, assumed to be this character, but they can't see, say, or do anything that they may wish to do, unless it is of course in Detective Marlowe's, and more clearly the director's, interests. Beatty goes further, adding, when an attractive woman walks into the room, his eyes follow her. The identification is clearly male. Since the option of alternate reaction, perception, and feeling are not really open to the audience watching the film, a kind of conflict is set up between the two. We never get to see most of what happened, i.e. the murders and so on. Worse still, Marlowe goes off and does interviews and sees things which the audience is not privy to. Thus, Marlowe has more information than the audience. Because the decision on where to look is not made by the audience, an awkward problem with long first-person camera shots, a conflict develops in the viewer's mind as to who they are. We cannot feel what the detective feels, and without a reaction shot, there is no way to tell. The spectator is almost left stranded if they do not identify with Marlowe's perspective, or wish to engage in any other manner, and lose their sense of self unafforded much of their own interpretation, if any at all.
Oh, maybe you could find something else, a gun maybe.
Why don't you just look beautiful? And quit worrying about guns, and dead females, and missing ones, and that $1 million you want to marry.
Crystal drank a lot. She had a violent temper.
Start being a woman. Quiet down long enough to hear your heartbeat. You might wake up and find it's a different world.
I'm paying you to wake up and find Crystal Kingsby.
I don't want to talk about that.
I do.
Okay. If that's what you want, I'll go on with this. I'll go and see Lavery today.
Lavery? Why Lavery?
He's in the middle, isn't he? You want Crystal found, don't you?
Well, he doesn't know where she is. You went over there once.
This time I'll watch his right hand.
Stay away from Lavery. Go back to the lake. You did fine there.
That is to say, this of course becomes even more complex when our main character is an all-star cybermatronic mute mass murderer like that of the 2016 film Hardcore Henry, exclusively shot from the first person. This film also contains its fair share of the male gaze, as Henry and Jimmy, the two main characters, visit a strip club, is littered with uninventive female roles and machismo, and much of the plot revolves around an uncomplex psychopath and his equally stereotypical wife, while they run around dying and resurrecting. Although Where Lady in the Lake fails to truly involve the audience, focusing on Marlowe and who he is, Hardcore Henry tries to make the audience the character, utilizing recent technology standards in a new and interesting format. In an article for Consequence titled A Quick History of First-Person Film, Nico Lang writes, Hardcore Henry offers a new take on POV through the evolution of film technology. Russian director Ilya Nashuler and his team used GoPros to come as close to that experience as possible. When Lady in the Lake debuted, Vincent Canby, the notoriously arid critic from the New York Times, dismissed the film as a gimmick, arguing that it neglects to make the camera an active participant. To answer that criticism, Hardcore Henry had to re-envision what the camera could be. That mission is nothing if not well-timed. On March 28, 2016, Oculus Rift released its long-awaited headset to the public. Thus far, it's viewed by the public as a gaming console, but it suggests enormous possibilities for pushing the limit of perspective. No longer is the camera mounted and slow-moving, but evidently strapped to the director and the actors' faces, using a mask and GoPros. Henry does insane parkour all over Moscow, running on top of bridges, climbing through jungle gym-like buildings, etc., all the while competing against waves of enemies as if it were a Call of Duty campaign.
Простое правило для съемки от первого лица. Чем шире угол обзора камеры и лучше видно тело, тем больше у зрителя создается ощущение погружения в происходящее на экране.
GoPro – это камера, настоящая экшн-камера. Она создана для людей, которые прыгают, бегают, падают, ломаются.
Когда ты держишь ее в руках и понимаешь, что с ее помощью будут снимать кино, ощущение, в общем, это вполне такое несерьезное. Очень напоминает аферу.
Мы пробовали разные другие фотоаппараты. Мы хотели заказать Blackmagic, Серега хотел Sony. Мы их даже поехали в магазин, потестили. Мы носились так вот через магазин, чтобы понять, насколько там происходит роллинг-шаттер.
With new tech at the turn of the digital age, new forms of cinematography have arrived, as have new mediums, such as the likes of video games and their popularity, adapted into this film. Of course, where some video games are highly subjective and offer extensive choices, it begs the question if Hardcore Henry has a similar approach, and how spectators may react to the given circumstances. In a study conducted by So-Yi Lim and Byron Reeves of Yonsei University and Stanford, respectively, they experimented with the amount of arousal from players with the ability to choose your own character or not, whether the game was in the first person or the third person perspective, and between female and male players. Almost expectedly, character choice led to further arousal overall, but more in male players, and the visual perspective alone had no effect, but dependent on avatar choice, led to greater arousal in the third person rather than the first. The study then suggests that the gender of the player had a significant impact on the experience, and therefore implies theoretical implications of self-representation and the player's psychophysiological responses. With the film, then, it can be assumed that having Henry be a male character, and certainly undertake a first-person male perspective, the implications of the male gaze applies and impacts how a viewer may feel represented, while lacking no choice of character or the third person. Admittedly, Hardcore Henry gives the first-person perspective more purpose than, say, Lady in the Lake, as the spectator has more room for interpretation of the plot, as the viewer and Henry receive the same information. But of course that still leaves room for what choices someone may wish to make. But how can this be explored further when more characters are incorporated and manipulated by the experience, and when the limits of the first person are broken? With Lady in the Lake and Hardcore Henry being relatively uncritical or aware of the perspective and its implications, being John Malkovich goes above and beyond in its thinking and interpretation for the spectator, much like the thoughts introduced in Jennifer Barker's The Tactile Eye. With the understanding that the entire human experience exists simultaneously as the subject for which everyone interprets their own perspectives, and the object of other perspectives, interpreted by other subjects in their own manner, then the film must take upon its own subject and object concept, expressing its own vision and rewarding its own interpretations by others. As characters enter the John Malkovich hole and are sucked into his head, they assume the perspective of the character, yet maintain their own perspective and thoughts simultaneously. Customers begin lining up outside of the John Malkovich hole like a theater for the John Malkovich blockbuster experience. This experience brings great pleasure, similar to the concepts explored in the Lemon-Reeves study, but also complicates the idea of the first-person perspective by adding what a spectator experiences with films like Hardcore Henry and Lady in the Lake.
Now, when you say that I can be somebody else, what do you mean exactly?
Well, we mean exactly that. We can put you inside someone else's body for 15 minutes.
Can I be anybody that I want to be?
Well, actually,
You can be John Malkovich.
It's perfect. It's my second choice, but it's wonderful. I'm a fat man. I am sad and I'm fat.
$200.
Yes.
okay, you gotta crawl in there.
Oh my God.
No, that's what I'm saying. See, I don't really need an extra bath mat. So if I get the set, would it be possible if I could just get maybe 3 extra hand towels? Bath mat?
The simple first-person view, no feeling or experience, of a wealthy movie star excites the general public, but as one of the main characters, Craig gains control with the ability to feel and be John Malkovich, their objective and subjective views come into question. Where and even who is Craig, and who is now John Malkovich? How should he, himself, and his actions be interpreted, especially existing within an American society devoted to fame and fortune, and by its existence as a film?
And so it was that just 8 short months ago, John Malkovich dropped the bombshell that sent shockwaves through the entertainment community. Turning his back on his former profession, Malkovich had to start from scratch and pay his dues all over again as a fledgling puppeteer.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Malkovich. It's the Emmis. Really, John Malkovich.
Inevitably, this comes to Craig's ruin, prevented by the laws of the film's world, or the film's perspective, and greater society, rather, and he is doomed to eternal subjectivity, existing in the head of his former spouse's child.
Maxine. Maxine. I love you, Maxine. Oh, look away. Look away. Look away. Look away. Look away. Look away. Look away.
Craig then has the inability to feel and experience the world, locked in a metaphorical prison of the first-person point of view, delving even further into questions of the human and film experience. The film intends to recognize its own and broader flaws, while intending that the spectator remains vigilant. You're meant to be yourself, for you could get stuck in Craig's world. Largely, the use of solely the first-person perspective is constraining in film and its relation to the spectator. Spectator has no ability of applying interpretation to information presented, limited in their viewing, and subject to whatever gaze or perspective the character assumes, losing most attempts at identification with particular characters and viewers alike. For certain circumstances, like that of Lady in the Lake and Hardcore Henry, it can and is often seen as a gimmick, brandishing the intellectual property of another medium, like literature or video games. This may be true, but films like this do benefit from development of new technology in cinematography, giving the viewer new and possibly unexplored experiences over the course of film history. Whereas being John Malkovich offers up an intention and gives the first-person perspective a point of contact with the spectator, exploring and detailing perspective itself fully in the own confines of a film.